Hello, everybody. This is Charlene with The Truth About Cancer and The Truth About Vaccines. And I have a very special guest, a longtime friend of ours, Dr. Judy Mikovits. Dr. Judy has been a great blessing and asset to humanity. She has been through so much. She's a brilliant scientist, and she's done a lot of cutting-edge research. And she found things that were very controversial, and the powers that be wanted to silence her and told her that they didn't want her to talk about what she was finding. But for her love for truth and humanity, she said, no, I can't be silent. I must tell the truth. And as a result, no good deed goes unpunished. She received a 5-day jail sentence and a 5-year gag order. And that was painful all by itself. But now she's talking and she's telling the rest of the story. And the world is listening, Judy. The world is listening to you. And personally, right now, we have been censored on every social media platform and by mainstream media. They're hitting us with lies, with articles. The Today Show hit us on, the vaccine content that we cover, as you can imagine, and Dell and Sherry and others. But right now, Twitter knocked us off on all 3 of our accounts because they don't want people to know. We just launched a 9-part docuseries, The Truth About Vaccines 2020, knowing this was a year, Judy, this was a year that people needed to understand the truth about vaccines. We knew that something big was happening around Healthy People 2020. We talked to you and others on the roundtable of experts about that. And I encourage all of the viewers, if you haven't seen the roundtable, please do so. Click in. We'll include the links for you to watch those. But Judy, right now, with all the censorship, the plague of corruption, that amazing book, you've appeared on Twitter, and overnight you've got over 100,000 followers. I was one of your only 20 people you were following before they knocked us out. So we're gone. We're fighting that. We'll see where that goes. But people are listening. The President of the United States has listened. He's heard you. And this has them, I think, very afraid, because the truth is not on the sides of the powers that be. And so because you have a large audience and you've been able to press through that bubble of censorship, they're doing the classic smear campaign because they can't muzzle you. So now they're smearing. So let's just start from the beginning with the problem, the reaction, and the solution. And ours is different than mainstream, isn't it, Judy? Our problem is real. Our reaction is a result of that real problem. And we do have solutions. So we're going to get into that. Judy, tell us from the beginning about the plague of corruption.
Well, I think it goes back, if I may share my screen, because this is the talk that you asked me for last year at the Truth About Cancer live event in Anaheim here. And as I think I mentioned to you when I got there, I was so excited to get your invitation to come again. The first time I was there, it was in 2016. It was, right after that silencing, under threat of arrest. It wasn't a typical gag order, which is something people say, oh, there was no gag order, show us the gag order. So the first thing is, no, they arrested me in 2011, and we'll go into that without due process or anything, held me in jail, threatened, extorted, did everything they could to get me to renounce the data that remain right and true to this day about adventitious viruses, about mouse cancer-causing virus, contagious monkey viruses, literally being injected in vaccines at alarming rates, as we can see the alarming increases in cancer in our world. So when you asked me for the next day, you wrote and said, great, I'd like you to talk about persecution and cover-up. And my heart just sank. I thought I'd come back to the world where I was going to get to talk about healing with plants and all the other wonderful things that we saw there at the Truth About Cancer, that we see every year at the Truth About Cancer. And I got persecution and cover-up. Well, the interesting part of that is to tell the story and to write the story. I had to you know, the slides are due a month or so before before the actual event, and I was in Idaho giving another talk, and so Dr. Rossetti wrote to me and he texted me and he said, Dr. J, is there anything I could do to help? Because he knew I had these slides due. And I'm so fearful that if I don't get the slides in on time, you won't have me there. And I so much wanted to come. So I said, sure, Frank, could you find me that mug shot they put in the journal Science? And he texts back, a little F no, with the big capital F. I'm not ruining my weekend. And so, I wrote the talk. And what I basically did was, in order to do it myself, I basically went back to the beginning. And so it's important to know that Plague of Corruption wasn't the first book we wrote on this subject. The first book is on the left-hand panel of this first slide. And it's called, you know, Plague. And it's, as I looked for, as we found, it's the science behind what we found. It's the science behind our publications. It's everything you're going to see in this slideshow here. And Plague of Corruption, I thought, you know, and so the new front material in that paperback is what I learned since the hardback came out, which has a dark green cover, about Tony Fauci. So, and what they call the multi-center study, which was directed by Ian Lipkin, was in fact fraud. And so this little text at the bottom says, that's the inconvenient truth. Retroviruses and environmental toxins led to this explosion of chronic diseases. And that's what I said when the book came out in November of 2014. So the good news about being silenced for 5 years, what I was told after I was released from jail, is if I talked to anyone, used any social media, anyone who wasn't my lawyer or my family on email, they would come into my house. They would do what they did the first time, which was remove all my computers, all my papers, all my stuff, and take everything and throw me back in jail and charge me with doing, with being a fugitive from justice, which I guess is for failing to renounce the data, because there never was a warrant and there never was a charge. And we'll go into you can't be a fugitive from justice, a felony charge. You can't be a fugitive if you don't have a warrant or so much as a parking ticket. What made me a fugitive? Was it my refusal to renounce the retroviruses and the environmental toxins in a contaminated blood supply and vaccines? Well, likely that's what it is. So we started the second book when I met Brian Hooker for the first time in a meeting on August 31st of 2014. And he was at a meeting in California, Studio City, for an autism. I think it was a Thrive meeting led by our friend Dana, put together. And in that meeting, he showed a picture of William Thompson's notebook. And I'm like, oh my God. I suddenly realized kind of the light bulb went on, because I couldn't understand the ferocity of the events of the last 5 years. Why it made no sense, because we'd actually cleaned up the blood supply and that's not a problem anymore. And I really honestly had no idea. So the key to everything, you'll see this book, Kent Heckenlively is the co-author of both books. Why is that significant? He's a lawyer. So I didn't break any laws. So during those 4 years where I was literally in my home, afraid to, pick up the phone and call the wrong person for fear the same things would happen again, pretty well full on PTSD, Kent Heckenlively, a lawyer, writes every bit of the story. He tapes every word I say. He writes me and he says every day, he said, okay, I want to talk about day one in jail. Okay, I want to talk about the multi-center study. Okay, I want to talk about the invitation only meeting. And all of those things are in the first book, Plague. As we flash back, from the day I'm arrested and sitting in jail, literally thinking, WTF? what is going on here? And literally praying to God, he showed me what's going on, because nothing made any sense. You know, I'm just going through my life, going to job interviews, fine. Who didn't get fired before? Fine. I've got $5 million in grants, and fine. I've got, you know, this major discovery in this paper, which at the time of my arrest, the only part that had been retracted was the mistake. So there was a partial retraction issued by science. But when the disease associations and everything became too much for them, that's when they staged the character assassination, the arrests, the threats, and force the retraction. And that's what Plague of Corruption talks about. You know, from Bobby's, you know, fabulous forward, Bobby Kennedy Jr., when he understood what was going on, when he talked to me and he correlated William Thompson, that's what it meant with meeting Brian Hooker. What did the page of that notebook say that lit, you know, was like the Holy Spirit saying, you know, this is the message. This is why I brought you here this day. I mean, nobody wants to drive through California on the Friday before Labor Day. You know, nobody. Through Los Angeles. So what that notebook said was, what are we going to do about the problem with the blacks? And that was William Thompson writing in his notebook, in his handwriting, an email typed to it where all the authors on what we now know is that criminal fraudulent study that MMR can and does in fact cause autism in susceptible children. And the most susceptible were blacks, if given the 4.4-fold, I think it was, more susceptibility if given the vaccine before they were 3 years old. And that's the day I realized this was pure satanic email, because all I could think to myself was, do you really, you couldn't wait until a vulnerable child was 3 years old? You knowingly, and William Thompson knowingly, buried those data, participated in a data burning party, and shut up for 20 years while millions of children and millions of families were destroyed, including, you know, Brian Hooker's, including my friend Dr. Sheila Ely's son Temple, including, you know, millions of children around the world. That's when I knew it was pure evil. And I actually thought back to some research we had done in the 90s, where we were trying to determine why Black men and women got more aggressive prostate and breast cancers. And the biomarkers were the same. They were the biomarker from the people who were getting the retroviruses, the mouse cancer-causing viruses. It was the immune pathway known as RNA cell. So that's the topic of this whole book. So the day I saw that truth, I sat down and I typed my co-investigators from 1999 from those biomarker studies. And I let them have it. As you'll see in Plague of Corruption, I'm good at writing emails. So, well, and that was one of the things the government wanted, all my emails. You didn't, you know, why do you want all my emails? Oh, because I was told by my employer, who was a lawyer, and committed crimes against me and criminal felonies for which he is now a convicted felon for having Harry Reid's illegally elected on several occasions, but he was only convicted of one. And that's significant to this story, because you know, crimes were committed by my employers, and my employers were forgiven those crimes. And we can see that as we go through, and I'll go through a little more rapidly. But at any rate, I wrote an email and I said, you're kidding me. You know, you're just, you know, and I wrote it very clear to all the people that what that biomarker meant. If we left science uncensored, if we didn't cover up those inconvenient truths, we could have solved all of it. We could have solved all of it. stopped the vaccines, cleaned up the vaccines, done what made a safe vaccine. But again, they couldn't afford the foreword of the first book by Hillary Johnson, the title of it, of Plague, the foreword in the plague, is a disease to affect the economy of nations. They couldn't afford it. We knew what happened with a contaminated blood supply when only 1 million Americans were infected by HIV. So the plague of corruption walks through my realization from that date on that this had nothing to do with science. This had nothing to do with medicine or data, that this was a plague of corruption, and they would censor me and anyone else, and at all costs, even to death, kill you to keep you quiet. So this is the proof of that. On September 6th and 7th in 2011, and this is a chapter of our first book, so I won't stay there too long. We and others from internationally around the world showed a lot of data at an NIH clinical center meeting about the number of diseases and how many people were infected and how many different diseases were associated with this mouse family and monkey families, not just mice, because other animals have gamma retroviruses. So we showed how many people and how many diseases were infected. And importantly, I gave a talk where the controls I showed in chronic fatigue syndrome, again, 70% were with the disease had the virus, was a very strong association. But I showed 4% was in the blood supply, was in the controls. Francis Collins, the head of the NIH, asked one question at that September 6th and 7th meeting at NIH 2010. Our paper was published October 8th, 2009, first online, and then October 23rd in the journal Science of 2009. And so this meeting was held, essentially a year later, and all of the other people who had been working with our technologies were seeing similar things, and it was exploding. And so Francis Collins asked me a question. He said, "Where did you get the controls?" And I said, "My colleagues got them from the blood supply in London." So why were agency heads? So this is a former CDC employer, 20-year CDC employee, Dr. Suzanne Vernon, who wrote, "Agency heads are scared to death if XMRV works out." And she gave that talk. She made that comment 4 days after that meeting. That meeting, when I answered the question, the blood supply, Francis Collins directed Tony Fauci to do a full, large-scale, multi-center study on the gamma retroviruses, the XMRVs, in MECFS, a multi-center blinded study to check if they had gotten into humans via the contaminated blood in vaccines, as our work showed. So, agency heads, just remember the agency heads because it's going to matter. So here is how the government has been censoring and silencing work and through journals. So the journals are commissioned fraud. The journals and the editorials, this is what we're going to show, how Science the Journal and the editorial. So to write this talk, when Dr. Rossetti decided he wouldn't help me find that picture, all I did was go to sciencemag.org and search Mikovits and Cohen, Cohen, and Mikovits with an S, not a Z. It's like Liza Minnelli. So,
I like it.
That song I always think of when I do my name. But at any rate, so in 2010, Harvey Alter published in another esteemed journal, PNAS, literally the validation. He isolated a gamma retrovirus, a mouse-related gamma retrovirus, which is what XMRV means, different strains, which our work clearly showed. And he isolated it in 86% of the people with chronic fatigue syndrome and 6.6% in the healthy blood donors. Uh-oh, here we go again, healthy blood donors. 25 times to 50 times. How much is 6.6% of America in 2010? Is it 40 million or 30 million? I'm not much of a mathematician, I'm a biologist. But so as the data became more clear how heavily contaminated the blood supply was, and we're not talking about vaccines, none of our work touched vaccines. Nothing that we did in these, it was only the blood supply, because that was our experience from HIV/AIDS. That's how the delay in the publication and the fight over who owned the patent between the French or the Americans, Luc Montagnier or Bob Gallo, whatever, the NCI. That was the delay that caused millions to be infected through a contaminated blood supply. And now this is 25 times that, because at the height of HIV in 1991, it was only 1 million Americans. This is 25 to 30 or 40 times that. And this is the problem. So what these journals did, the journal PNAS held the confirmation study through the summer of 2010, in July 4th, while the CDC quickly made a fraudulent study. And I can prove that to you on the blood system working group and our emails, because I kept the emails and I kept talking through emails, because that boss of mine told me in 2010, don't put anything you don't want discoverable in the body of an email. I learned very young, when somebody tells you something, ask yourself why. So from that day on, I protected all of those data. I wrote detailed everything in the body of an email. And those were some of the things that, while I was held silent, they tried everything they could while I was held in jail to get my emails. And I refused to give them up, and continue to this day. We have every email. And at any rate, so in 2011, Harvey Alster picked the poison to have his study withdrawn. And the reason why he had it withdrawn was not because he couldn't repeat it, but because he ran out of samples. So he didn't have the samples from the original study, therefore he couldn't do it again. And so he had to withdraw the paper. But in our case, we had the patients, we had the samples, we had the people, and we could easily show that we could reproduce our work. And so they tried to get us to destroy the data. And of course we would not. And that's more of the story of Plague of Corruption. It goes through exactly how they tortured me. And we'll do that here. And we refused. So if the journal retracts the paper, it implies fraud. And just like they have factcheck.org, who has the person who called me 2 nights ago and had no intention of fact checking, because she wouldn't take a paper or let me email her any of the proof of anything that was said. She just simply said, hey, it's 8:30 at night and I just finished working all day and cooking my husband dinner. And she said, what's the title of the paper Tony Fauci delayed? I said, what about the fact that they took 30 years of all of my computers and all of my papers out of my office under the direction of Tony Fauci, my entire 2 offices and 30 years of work and everything out of my home in November? Why do you think I could come up with that paper? Really? From 1984, when there was no internet? Yeah, Frank Rossetti can come up with that paper, and that's what I told her. And by the way, I'm not an author, because technicians weren't authors in those days. And of course, they took every paper I had. They took every piece of work. In fact, I'll get up and show you the only thing I have left when we get to the notebooks.
This is amazing. I'm just listening to you. While you're back there looking for that, I just wanted to add, I don't know if the screen is going to show me, because we're sharing the screen. Maybe when we're not looking at the slides, we can get off that screen share. Okay, here we go. This is just, I just wanted to put a little pause and then continue with this story. This is so shocking. I'm sure that the viewer is thinking a lot of what I'm thinking. It's I mean, you mentioned torture in there, Judy. You were tortured. They took all of your computers, your papers, while you were, I think, in jail, and then you were under the gag order for 5 years. I really want to dig into that. I'm sure that the viewers do too. This is phenomenal, and you have proof, as much proof as you can have with. And you were talking about it far before today, and like you're saying, these are slides from the Truth About Cancer live event in California. So just to back it up a little bit, I know you wanted to talk about herbal remedies and so forth and how we can heal our bodies, but God had for you to be talking about the corruption issue, because clearly this fills in a gap that needed to be filled for the world to see the truth, which has been hidden for many years, like you said, 3 decades.
Yeah. And would it have been hidden again? So this is and that's, so what I went to get and it is torture. It is mental torture when they extort your husband, when they push him in the chair. Actually, they locked down everything in my lab September 29th of 2011, 6 weeks before I was arrested. And that's important later, but you see this little book?
Yes.
With Minnie Mouse. I had a friend in Frederick who used to give me these little journals, and this is the so-called notebooks that I supposedly kept. And
Judy, can you take the screen share off so we can see you with that book? Can you take just for a second? You could share it in a minute, but sure. I'd like to see you in that book. Okay, so hold that up.
Here's me in the book, and you see Minnie Mouse. And if I open it up, it talks about a meeting. Here's the taped in piece of paper of a meeting agenda on macrophages and the importance of HIV. And this was my journal from my meeting notes in 1997. And
wow.
In 1997. So this was in Frank's office when he was forced to retire. And at the end of Plague of Corruption, in the last chapter, I won't spoil the suspense for your readers, but Frank Rossetti was told to do what William Thompson did. And of course, Frank Rossetti is a man of honor and integrity, and he refused. And that's the story. That's the Plague of Corruption. That's what they're worried about. So we met with the FBI shortly after Frank Rossetti was forced to retire and came to Carlsbad, and handed me this and much, much, much more in 2014. And I held it in front of the FBI agent, and I put him in front of him and said, "Who does this belong to?" And he looked through it for a while, and he said, "Whoever's handwriting it is." And you know, this, I supposedly stole Minnie Mouse. And you'll see that at the end of the Plague, the book. It's like the lady in jail, the astute lady in jail, who we nicknamed Crazy Mary. She was a very sweet lady, but she said, "Hey, she stole her own brain." I said, at least it's a felony charge and not petty theft. And so you don't find humor in it. Yeah. You can't survive. But at any rate, the torture is, and you try not to think about it, but wedding pictures, your PhD thesis, you know, literally everything. We didn't have computers then. We didn't have, you know, it's a hard copy. I don't have a copy of 30 years of notes. And what I had told my employers late in the summer of 2011, when we were supporting our findings, and the molecular biology and the virology supported every word we said, and it still does in all of our papers. The microbiome, the DNA methylation, everything is solid except for the sequence of the virus. And that mistake was Bob Silverman's, and it proved we held the patents. Not Abbott, not Silverman, not DeRisi, not the government. Frank Rossetti and Judy Mikovits, and not in Frank Rossetti through National Cancer Institute, but Judy Mikovits should have been through her employers, but we didn't have a contract. We had a handshake. So in those days, from September 29th to, meaning they didn't own the patent, Judy Mikovits did. So from September 29th to November 18th, and it actually was probably November 4th. November 18th was when I was jailed. And directed by Tony Fauci, because he came to the lab. He sent his grants administrators, Kathy Laughlin, and the person who was the administrator on our $5 million grant, to the Institute, to my offices, to my laboratories before I was jailed. And they confirmed everything was there. Everything was there. All the IRB protected data, all the samples, all the everything was there. And so that's what's important in this paper. So in the talk, I just showed the who and why. So here, are we sharing screen again?
Yeah, you could share the screen. And real quick, before you do, I just wanted to mention, you first got on our stage, I think in 2016. I know Ty interviewed you for The Truth About Vaccines. And when he did that interview with you, Judy, he literally called me on the phone, and then we talked about it when he came home, but he was almost in tears, moved in his spirit and his heart, as I am and was then, that you have been through all of this. You've endured so much for a good cause, that you didn't succumb to the threats and to the temptations of taking material money or whatever it was that they were offering you, but you just did the right thing. And it's horrifying to know that there are people that are in control of our government and government agencies that are doing this and tearing you apart, and not only you, but other people like you. And personally, I don't know a whole lot of people like you that have been through what you've been through, but I believe that God has brought us together for a time such as this. Right. When I was talking to you in DC, we went and lobbied Congress together. That was a lot of fun with Del Bigtree and other people. I think Bobby Kennedy was there. And then we had Brian Hooker was there, that Tony Bark was there. It was a good time. And we had the BBC reporter. She was there to hit us all. And Bobby was in her face. I don't remember that. So, right. But we sat together and had lunch, and you talked about these retroviruses and everything that was going on there. And all of the discussions we've had with you, I think that we all didn't know about Fauci as well as we know now, because he's been put out there front and center. Right. And so the name Fauci, talking to you, that name, it's putting a face and a name to the order that was given to pretty much either you shut up or we're going to destroy you. And so I would really like to get into that, because right now Fauci is the authority. Right. And right now, because you're telling the truth and people are listening to you, and you've broken through this bubble of censorship, and millions, I saw The Plague of Corruption, the clip that you are featured in that film. It got to 2 million views in less than one day after having to repost because YouTube keeps censoring and taking it down. The next day I hit refresh without taking a screenshot, and it was taken down again. So it's all over the place. Everybody's posting it. We've got it on Brighteon, and we've got it on our IGTV, and it's gone viral. People are listening to you, and they're afraid. And so as a result, the Edward Bernays classic propaganda, if you can't muzzle the person, then let's smear their character and peg them as a liar and even dangerous. And that's what we're seeing now. What you're saying is absolutely the truth. We know it to be so. Right. And the proof corroborates everything that you're saying. But now we've got CNN and NBC and the different Washington Post and so forth, all of these mainstream media outlets all together with their talking points. And we showed, Judy, in our film how they all get the same talking points and say them verbatim over and over again. It's kind of a joke. And if you don't know that by now, we're trying to sound the alarm and wake people up to the fake news factor that's playing here. But Judy, you're the recipient of this, and we've been hit and attacked too. Right now, this storm is worldwide. You've got the president's ear, the White House is listening, people high up are listening. What would you say to the mainstream hit pieces? Because we have fans that love us and love you, and they're asking, and we're just telling them the truth. What would you say to them?
Well, what I say is, it's all there in 2 books. heavily references that lawyer after lawyer after lawyer for Simon & Schuster. Those aren't self-published books. And it's all in the slides we gave in Truth About Cancer last year. Here's the names on the screens. My nephew, I won't use his name, one of my sweet nephews said, okay, Aunt Judy, who and why? Who and why? And so the slide we posted in that, and it's the who and why. And so nobody can deny, for instance, nobody can deny. Is that sharing now?
No, it's not. While you're trying to do that, what's going through my mind, and maybe the viewers as well, Fauci.
Yeah, here he is.
Fauci is lead. Okay, there he is. Let's go through.
So here's the who and why. So
oh wow,
the page on the left is from a July 22nd, 2009 invitation only meeting, a secret meeting held by the entire government, the entire level, and that's a chapter of plague. It's right there. It's here are the names. Here's everybody that agreed on July 22nd, 2009. The data and the big, oh my God, was, do you mean all those sequences we saw since the 80s were real? And everything is in our book. So I have nothing. They smeared me in 2011. And between 2011 and 2019, we wrote 2 books with thousands of references, proof, those emails I just told you about. This, here's Tony Fauci. This is 2011. And Plague of Corruption talks about Harold.
Name these people. Who are these people in this picture?
Yeah, the only ones that really matter in this picture are, this is Francis Collins on the far right. Next to him is obviously Tony Fauci. We see Hillary Clinton, who was Secretary of State in 2011. And we see Harold Varmus, who was the head of the National Cancer Institute, brought in 2011 to take care of Frank Rossetti and make XMRV go away. And these are the threats that we'll talk about through the rest of the thing. This lady was the head of NIDA, Drug Enforcement Agency. I don't remember the acronym NIDA. And this is an investigator, I believe an Israeli investigator, getting an award of millions of dollars to do cannabis research. That's illegal in this country, and the patent is held since 2004. So you could see the pattern of what they do. And the pictures only because, who was involved in 2011. Who, Francis Collins was the one that said, where'd you get the controls? Directed Fauci to pay for a large multi-center study and to show the association with the chronic fatigue syndrome. They didn't deny the blood supply was contaminated. So we can quickly pop through some of these other things because you see all the diseases, it doesn't really matter. But this is an important part of the story. How did mouse retroviruses get into humans? And this is a picture in the book that was drawn by Athena, who was a friend of Ernie Hancock. Ernie Hancock of Freedom's Phoenix gave me a voice for at least the last 6 years. As soon as I could start talking in October of 2015, it was technically a 4-year gag order, but and the gag order was simply, if you do any of these things, talk to anyone other than the lawyer, talk on the radio, do anything, we'll come back and this time, that you'll never get out of jail. And so I couldn't run that risk because there was nothing legal about the first time. So it wasn't a technical gag order. Everybody will say, show me the gag order. No, I'll show you the proof of the evidence of what they took. So this was another scientist who wrote one of the most widely distributed biological products that involved mice and mouse tissues, especially up until recent years, vaccines, especially vaccines against viruses. It is possible that mouse retrovirus were present in the viral stocks, cultured and used for vaccine production. That's your mouse-o-matic from the Saturday Night Live Vass-o-matic. So you're in this vat and you grow it up in another animal tissue. What are we talking about with SARS COVID-19? And then we inject it. We don't purify it. We don't clean it up. We directly inject it into the most vulnerable children. those black boys under 3 years of age. And that drives disease. And that was January of 2011. So that's when the hatchet job started. That's when the hunt to kill me. So when the email was heavily contaminated, and when the blood supply was heavily contaminated, I was told to rush a paper into Science that was a fraudulent paper. And I'll show it in the next slide why it's fraud. And I wrote this email on August 31st, 2011, to Simone Glenn, the head of the NHLBI, the National Institute of Heart, Lung, and Blood, who was controlling, the blood supply contamination. This study was going to be fraud, not admitting the blood supply wasn't heavily contaminated, which it was at least 10% by all the data. And remember, I showed you 6.6%. Can't afford it. A disease to affect the economy of nations. And so in this email, which is in its entirety in Plague of Corruption, I wrote, they were trying to rush it to press, and I said impossible for every reason. And I said, given the flawed study design was agreed upon, we can't agree in a manuscript in a day. It's not good science and appropriate. What's the rush? Afraid of the truth? How many of these viruses were introduced into the human population and are now threatening a lot more than the blood supply because a few declared it impossible 40 years ago. And JC, this is John Coffin, and I think I said in the talk I gave at Truth About Cancer, and I don't mean Jesus Christ, himself was the most vociferous. Oh, that's impossible. That's impossible. And I said, I'm sending it only to Simone and Frank because I will make this rush to publish a public relations nightmare for the entire U.S. government. And I said, are you kidding me? Human retroviruses, contagious human retroviruses from vaccines, from lab workers, doctors, the first ever contagious human retrovirus spread like mycoplasma. Are you kidding me? It happened once. How many of these cell lines? These sick people lost their entire lives. And this tragedy of justice will not be carried out at their expense again. Well, you know what COVID-19 is? The attempt to kill them all. If they succeed at this vaccine, you will kill the people with the mitochondrial deficiencies, with the cytokine storms, with the vaccine injured, the autistic spectrum disorder, the Gardasil injury, and you will bury it all and call it COVID-19. And I said, and if this is rushed to print without a fair and balanced discussion of its limitations, I will spend every minute of my life exposing the fraud that's been perpetrated against this patient population. And I signed it, which I don't usually sign emails, but I did. And that's exactly what I did. The blood supply was heavily contaminated. We saw all diseases, including ITP. What's ITP? Oh, it's a bleeding disorder, thrombocytopenia. It's a bleeding disorder of platelets. Oh, what are we seeing COVID now on the autopsies? Oh, bleeding disorders. And what is ITP? Oh, a side effect of MMR. And it's clear it's a side effect, idiopathic thrombocytopenia. Oh, idiopathic means the idiots don't understand the pathogenesis or the cause. But we found XMRVs in 30% of people with ITP in a study that I showed and never got to publish in June of 11. So in June of 11, the nightmare, this talk was March 29th, 2011. And this is the point. We're walking through that. But what did we do? Oh, we came up with a mechanism. We had been doing studies with the company Cirrus, and we proved that it could rid the blood donations of all RNA pathogens, including the retrovirus. So they could clean it up in the blood supply, but they couldn't clean it out of the vaccines. You can't. You'll remove the antigen if you filter the other RNA viruses out of there. You won't, by definition, have a vaccine. So here's how they carried out their threat. They called me on the phone the Monday after the 4th of July, and Simone Glenn said she's got Harold Varmus on the phone, And if I don't put my name on this paper, which is fraud, it was not powered statistically to be an association study. It was, do we have a blood test that can quickly determine if the blood supply is contaminated? So they called me on the phone and I said, no. Frank Rossetti taught me, if every word on the paper you don't believe, you don't co-author it. And Simone Glenn said, okay, Harold Varmus is coming in and Frank Rossetti and Sandy Rossetti, his wife, will be fired. And this is the end. The reason why this is so important, the fiscal year ends in September. They will be fired for fraud in the original science study, which wasn't fraud, and we refused to retract it, and the journal wouldn't retract it. They left the data as right and true at this point in time. So this was, right before they rushed this to print, and that's why I show science. This is the Science Insider. So they're not technically the journal and the science. It's a reporter that drives the public opinion. So when I wrote that talk that day, 23 articles when I searched Science Mag and John Cohen with Mikovits and Cohen, 23 articles. And that's what the rest of this talk's right through. So when John Coffin told Frank Rossetti, November of 2010, Science, the journal started it, and science is going to end it. That is, we're going to destroy your reputations, Judy Mikovits and Frank Rossetti. I told him we wouldn't co-author the paper unless they wrote the paper that there was no test. It's not a confirmation study. He promised me, Michael Bush, who is the senior author on this paper, and that is fraud. He should be in federal prison. This paper is fraud, commissioned fraud. Guess who Michael Bush, this Blood Systems Research Institute, is making a ton of money from? Oh, grants from the government, the NHLBI, and now Cirrus, the company we proved our work showed could clean up the blood supply. He publishes this paper, and here John Cohen writes and says she hopes to have full sequences of her new viruses. They're not my new viruses. We had the sequences all along. We knew what they were. The folder was in my desk drawer. In a few weeks. This is written on September 30th, 2011. When was I fired? Without warning. My lab's locked down to everybody in my lab, and knowingly my employers, who have committed misappropriation of federal funds and Medicare fraud with an unvalidated diagnostic test, which we have emails from Michael Bush saying what he saw in their company, not our private. They had a private company making a test, a fraudulent test, to make money off people, and they just sent it out. And think about the testing. Oh, we heard in COVID-19, 80% of the tests were contaminated from the CDC. Oh, okay. Yeah, and it's okay to do those and inflict that on people, but you're going to charge the Whittemores with Medicare fraud, and they did misappropriate federal funds because they took reagents that were used to do the study and paid for in the grants, and they used them in their laboratory to produce the fraudulent test. And Michael Bush wrote me and Dr. Rossetti emails saying he saw that lab, he inspected that lab, he was scared what he saw, and he threatened me to get away from them. And I said, I don't work for that company. I run the institute. I run the nonprofit, and I don't have anything to do with those tests. They're their companies. And of course, I was fired the next day. So how did John Cohen know on September 30th of 2011 I would never see those sequences again? Oh, because my lab was raided the night I was fired. I was locked out. They took it all and wrote in their lawsuit or whatever they had that I had stolen the stuff. I had stolen intellectual property. I never went back there and could prove it, and did prove it in a letter, and that's why the later events ended. So how did he know that? Oh, because the Whittemores were going to be forgiven their crimes by Fauci, by and going to keep their grants and not going to get charged with misappropriation of federal funds and Medicare fraud, and that's exactly what happened. And so this is the hunt. So here you go. False positive is what the journal Science publishes the day before the meeting. September 22nd of 2011, again, John Cohen, false positive. Oh, the tests are false positive. There was no XMRV. It was all a mistake. It was all made up by that Judy Mikovits for her own greater glories. Here it is. Here it is, and he writes these articles, which are opinion articles, and tracks me down and smears me. That's why I don't care what anybody says today. They did this in 2011. They destroyed everything. If you can't be more humiliated, and you can't face more than I faced between 2011 and 2015, God's good. I'm just fine. I don't care what you call me. I have the proof. So here is some of the questions that were asked. So here's the threat. If I give the talk on September 22nd, which I gave a beautiful, masterful talk, talked about DNA methylation, talked about why the virus would be latent and be reactivated. If it was heavily methylated, you would never detect it on PCR. And I don't mean the word brilliant as an arrogant thing, but actually somebody in the crowd that had a company for DNA methylation said, that's brilliant. We can fix this. We can make a test. We can find out where it is. And so if we would not censor science and stop research for going ahead, just like why the little black boys? Well, we knew the biomarkers for breast and prostate cancer. We knew the immune responses that couldn't respond. So here's the key piece of paper. And I say the Whittemores are forgiven their crime in exchange for destroying the data. And Mikovits defends with solid science. So again, they were told to do what William Thompson did, and we're happy to carry that out, because at the end of the day, the embattled institute on February 8th of 2012 retains major grants, and they retain them to this day. Everyone on this paper and other papers are making millions of dollars to this day, taxpayers, to shut them up.